Lucy Burns, born on July 20, 1879, died on December 22, 1966, was an American suffragist and women's rights advocate. She was a passionate activist in the United States and in the United Kingdom, joined the militant suffragettes. Burns was a close friend of Alice Paul, and together they ultimately formed the National Woman's Party. Early life and education. Burns was born in New York to an Irish Catholic family. She was described by fellow National Woman's Party member Inez Haynes Irwin as a woman of twofold ability. She speaks and writes with equal eloquence and elegance. Mentally and emotionally, she is quick and warm. She has intellectuality of a high order, but she overruns with a winning Irishness which supplements that intellectuality with grace and charm. A social mobility of extreme sensitiveness and swiftness. She was a gifted student and first attended Packer Collegiate Institute, or what was originally known as the Brooklyn Female Academy, for second preparatory school in 1890. Packer Collegiate Institute prided itself on teaching girls to be ladies, and they emphasized religious education while advocating more liberal ideals such as educating the mind to habits of thinking with clearness and force. Burns also met one of her lifelong role models, Laura Wiley, while attending Packer Collegiate Institute. Wiley was one of the first women to go to Yale University Graduate School. Burns also attended Columbia University, Vassar College, and Yale University before becoming an English teacher. Burns taught at Erasmus High School in Brooklyn for 2 years. While Burns enjoyed the educational field, she generally found the experience to be frustrating and wanted to continue her own studies. In 1906, at age 27, she moved to Germany to resume her studies in language. In Germany, Burns studied at the universities of Bonn and Berlin from 1906 to 1909. Burns later moved to the United Kingdom, where she enrolled at Oxford University to study English. Burns was fortunate enough to have a very extensive educational background because her father, Edwards Burns, supported her and financed her international education. Early on activism. Burns's first major experiences with activism were with the Pankhursts in the United Kingdom from 1909 to 1912. While attending graduate school in Germany, Lucy Burns traveled to England where she met Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia. She was so inspired by their activism and charisma that she dropped her graduate studies to stay with them and work in the Women's Social and Political Union, an organization dedicated to fighting for women's rights in the United Kingdom. She started selling their newsletter Votes for Women, and joined a protest on June 29, 1909, and got arrested. Burns was later employed by the Women's Social and Political Union as a salaried organizer from 1910 to 1912. While working with the Pankhursts in the United Kingdom, Lucy Burns became increasingly passionate about activism and participated in numerous campaigns with the WSPU. She amazed a young Grace Roe for coming from America to support the movement, even saying she had come to London to be arrested, and that it was a very grave honor. One of her first major contributions was organizing a parade in Edinburgh as part of the campaign in Scotland in 1909. She was the WSPU Edinburgh organizer for 2 years. Burns was an active supporter of the campaign to boycott the 1911 census. She invited suffragettes from residents and non-residents of Edinburgh to a large gathering in the city's Vegetaria Café on the night of the census, so that they could not be officially registered. Prison in Britain. Burns was with Jenny Baines, Mary Lee, Alice Paul, Emily Davison and Mabel Capper trying to stop a Limehouse meeting on the budget by Lloyd George. In a fracas with a senior police officer led to Burns being described by the magistrate as setting an extremely bad example and getting a harsher sentence. While Burns is not a widely known speaker from the women's rights movement, she did make a variety of speeches in marketplaces and on street corners while in Europe. Her activism resulted in numerous court appearances and reports of disorderly conduct in the newspapers. In August 1909, she hid with Adela Pankhurst, Alice Paul and Margaret Smith on the roof of the St Andrew's Hall in Glasgow. She planned to break through the roof and disrupt a political speech by the Earl of Crewe in front of an all-male audience. Burns was again with Alice Paul and Edith New and other suffragettes in Dundee trying to enter a political meeting of Herbert Samuel, MP, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Unable to gain access, Burns then broke police station windows and got a 10-day sentence, where she and others went on hunger strike, damaged the cells, and refused to do prison work. Burns and Paul were involved in a stunt at the London Lord Mayor's ball, mingling with guests, then approaching Winston Churchill with a hidden banner shouting, "How can you dine here while women are starving in prison?" Again, this resulted in prison, self-starving, and force-feeding. Burns had been given a Hunger Strike Medal for Valor by WSPU. Relationship with Alice Paul. While working with the WSPU, Lucy Burns first met Alice Paul at a London police station. Both women had been arrested for demonstrating, and Alice Paul introduced herself when she noticed that Lucy Burns was wearing an American flag pin on her lapel. The women discussed their suffrage experiences in the United Kingdom and the American women's movement. Burns and Paul bonded over their frustration with the inactivity and ineffective leadership of the American suffrage movement by Anna Howard Shaw. Their similar passions and fearlessness in the face of opposition made them quickly become good friends. Both women were passionate about activism, and the feminist struggle for equality in the UK inspired Burns and Paul to continue the fight in the United States in 1912. Suffrage historian Eleanor Cliff compares the partnership of Paul and Burns to that of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She notes that they were opposites in appearance and temperament. Whereas Paul appeared fragile, Burns was tall and curvaceous, the picture of vigorous health. Unlike Paul, who was uncompromising and hard to get along with, Burns was pliable and willing to negotiate. Paul was the militant, Burns, the diplomat. Despite their stark differences, Paul and Burns worked together so effectively that followers would often describe them as having one mind and spirit. However, Paul described Burns as always more valiant than I was, about 1,000 times more valiant by nature. National American Women's Suffrage Association. Upon returning to the United States, Paul and Burns joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, as leaders of its congressional committee. Both women felt it was critical to hold the political party in power responsible for a federal suffrage amendment. By holding an entire party accountable, Paul and Burns believed that congressmen would be forced to take action or risk losing their seats. This militant tactic was presented by Paul and Burns at the 1912 NASA convention in Philadelphia to Anna Howard Shaw and other NASA leaders. NASA leaders rejected their proposal because they felt any action against the Democratic Party, which had just won the presidential election, was premature at that point. Not willing to back down without a fight, Burns and Paul enlisted the help of Jane Addams, a well-respected and more unorthodox NASA leader, to petition their cause to her fellow NASA leaders. While the women were forced to tone down their proposal, NASA leaders did authorize a suffrage parade, which Burns, Paul, and other activists organized as the Women's Suffrage Procession of 1913, occurring the day before Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. NASA's one stipulation was that Paul and Burns' congressional committee would receive no further funding from NASA. While Burns and Paul readily agreed to this stipulation, this event marked the beginning of their divide with NASA. After all of the turmoil of the past few years, Alice Paul announced a radical new plan for 1916. She wanted to organize a women's political party. Burns adamantly supported this plan, and on June 5, 6, and 7, 1916 at the Blackstone Theater in Chicago, delegates and female voters met to organize the National Woman's Party, NWP. Burns and Paul were committed to direct action in fighting for women's rights and particularly their right to vote. They were opposed by more conservative suffragists who advocated less militant tactics. NASA leaders thought the tactics of the National Woman's Party were futile and would alienate Democrats that were sympathetic to suffrage. Membership in the NWP was limited to only enfranchised women, and their sole goal was promoting a federal amendment for women's suffrage. Burns played a large role in the National Woman's Party. She worked in virtually every aspect of the organization at one time or another. Specifically, she was a chief organizer, lobby head, newspaper editor, suffrage educator, teacher, orator, architect of the banner campaign, rallying force, and symbol of the NWP. In Burns suffrage schools, she taught women how to conduct automobile campaigns, lobby, and work with the press, which they continued during the war. She was savvy with working with the media and supplied 200 news correspondents with frequent news bulletins. The National Woman's Party led dozens of women to picket the White House in Washington, D.C., as silent sentinels beginning in January 1917. A bipartisan organization, it directed its attacks at the office of the President of the United States, in this case, Woodrow Wilson. Burns also opposed World War I, seeing it as a war led by powerful men that resulted in young men being drafted and giving their lives with little free will. Throughout her career with the National Woman's Party, Burns was known to have a bitter sense of injustice and become angry because of the actions of the president or apathetic Americans. Final push for American suffrage. Burns and other suffragists had been told by the chairman of the House Committee on Suffrage that the House would not pass a suffrage amendment before 1920. To their surprise, it was announced in late 1917 that the House would make a decision on January 10, 1918. The amendment passed in the House by a vote of 274 to 136, and the women of the NWP, including Burns, began working on the 11 additional votes they would need for the amendment to pass in the Senate. Unfortunately, on June 27, 1918, the Senate narrowly failed to pass the amendment. Burns and Paul were utterly enraged, but after coming so close, there was no chance that they were going to give up now. They resumed their protests at the White House on August 6, 1918. Once again, the women were jailed, exposed to horrendous conditions, and released shortly thereafter. Their focus then was moved to helping pro-suffrage candidates get elected in November. For the first time, the NWP did not give allegiance to one party over another. They supported anyone who was willing to support suffrage, and this cost the Democrats their majority in Congress. As tensions grew between the suffragists and President Wilson, he realized something had to be done quickly to end the highly publicized protests and clashes between the police and suffragists. He requested that Congress convene for a special session in May 1919. On May 21, the House of Representatives passed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment 304-89, and on June 4, the Senate passed it 66-30. Surprisingly, the suffragists were very subdued at the announcement of this victory. The suffragists' battle was not yet over. They still had to make sure 3/4 supermajority of the states, which then numbered 48, ratified the amendment. Finally, on August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the Anthony Amendment, and Burns' quest for federal suffrage was finally over. At this point, Burns was completely exhausted and quoted as saying, "I don't want to do anything more. I think we have done all this for women, and we have sacrificed everything we possessed for them, and now let them fight for it now. I am not going to fight anymore." All of her time spent in jail and experiences as a suffragist had left her bitter towards married women and others who didn't take action during the suffrage movement. After the women of the United States gained the right to vote, Burns retired from political life and devoted herself to the Catholic Church and her orphan niece. She died on December 22, 1966 in Brooklyn, New York. Legacy. Burns was posthumously named an honoree by the National Women's History Alliance in 2020. Lucy Burns Institute. The Lucy Burns Institute, a nonprofit educational organization located in Madison, Wisconsin, is named after Burns. Lucy Burns Museum. The Lucy Burns Museum opened to the public on January 25, 2020, with a gala opening on May 9, 2020, in Loudoun, Virginia, on the former site of the Occoquan Workhouse, also called the Loudoun Reformatory, where the Night of Terror took place. The exhibits commemorate the activism and sacrifices of suffragists, also called silent sentinels. Thanks for watching HerStory channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe our channel.